Beast Kingdom has roughly been around for about 15 years, and I have heard of them here and there, but I was always kind of scared away from collecting anything from them since I've seen a couple of photos of their earlier stuff and it was just rather lacking, to put it mildly. Finally, it is here in the year of our Lord 2024 that their Batman Returns is making me finally pop my Beast Kingdom cherry. So it's time to get nuts and figure out whether or not Beast Kingdom could potentially be a McFarlane Toys killer. And appropriately, the first one we're going to be covering on the channel is going to be the recently released Batman Returns. I believe they're referring to it as the DAH082. That's the official licensing number or not serialized number that they're kind of adding to their line of action figures or collectibles that they've been doing, like I mentioned before, over 15 years, ever since 2009, on specific properties, movie licenses, even some video game and cartoon stuff. And finally, they're tackling some of the more in-depth stuff. They're tackled Keaton Batman before with the 89 proper, and I know that several people have already kind of owned that, covered it on the channel, but this one's a bit more of a recent release, and it was the one that I actually looked at some of the photos and thought to myself, that actually does not look too bad. I'm finally going to pull the trigger on a Beast Kingdom figure and see exactly how it really compares to some of the other figures that are within this middle tier kind of area, specifically McFarlane and even a little bit of Figuarts, though there has to be a little bit of an asterisk, a little bit of a caveat here, and that is that this is in fact the Michael Keaton 1992 Batman Returns costume, and it's a little bit on the limited side as far as what other companies have actually made an action figure out of this specific suit. Figuarts and Mafex have yet to tackle them, and McFarlane Toys, which I'm going to be using here for scale, has only really tackled the 89 Keaton Batman in two respective forms, either in the gold label variant, which is the one that you see before you here, and then the other one that is a bit more screen accurate, but I just personally don't gravitate to it as much as I did with this one, based on my recent yearly ranking, and that one was included in the Ultimate 6-Pack movie collection. I perceive this one to be a little bit more affluent as to what I'm trying to really portray here, which is going to be the scaling, and that's the area that Beast Kingdom decided to become a bit of a niche commodity amongst collectors, because they're going for 1/9 scale as opposed to 1/12, which is McFarlane. McFarlane goes for that 7-inch. This is arguably, I want to say, about 9-inch. I really don't want to say 10-inch just yet. I want to say this creeps closer to about 9 inches. And I believe that they're still going to be scaling things appropriately, especially when they roll around that Batfleck, that Justice League Batfleck that they recently announced and made available for pre-order. And I believe it's not really even going to be released until possibly even 2025. I honestly don't know what's going to take so long, but I digress. Here, however, we have the Keaton that looks to be in proper proportioning as far as that height, and that's why they go for the its scale. They go for that fractionized scale as opposed to measuring it by inches, even though it looks to me like it's going from 7 to 9. So you can kind of see right there where they're exactly scaling their figures. And then as you then go beyond height and go into detail and sculpting, you can see that there is a little bit of increased work and effort being made into some of the details amongst the costume, the likeness, and the actual body proportions that then makes the $60 price tag kind of easy to understand, but maybe not the most acceptable once you take a peek under the hood, because once you see here exactly the costume that's being replicated from that 1992 design, you'll notice that yes, for the most part, it is in fact very faithful. It may not necessarily float everybody's cup of tea, because some people prefer the much more texturized look, the very skin-like look to the 89 Keaton Batman version, because that one had the look to emulate the skin of a bat. That was obviously the influence behind the design of that suit. But then you have some other folks that really dig the return, especially with the very sculpted out abs here that look like a piece of armor. You then have the very circular pecs with then the, I guess some would argue, the more accurate bat symbol there on the chest, as opposed to the other one that had the little extra wingtips on the bottom part of the symbol. So this one actually is supposed to be a replica of the symbol they utilize in the merchandising. You have the much more straightforward yellow belt right here, and then the rest of it is smoothed out about. And one would argue that it does look a little bit on the toy side, especially around the leg area. I don't know how it is. I feel about this. I understand that it's supposed to be screen accurate, but in this scale, it just looks just a little too toyish, especially for the amount of price that you're paying. I wish that it could have gelled a little bit better together, especially when you get into a little bit of these gaps around the crotch area. I feel like that could have been assembled just a little on the stronger side. But then things get just a little bit more clever and thought out when you get to the boots. I really do like the little rivets here on the shins of the boots, and then as you navigate downwards, I really appreciate the look of rubberized texture to make it look a little bit more alive. And then if that wasn't enough, the little added detail of the bat symbol on that little I guess you could call it the shoe tongue that kind of covers up the joint area right here is a nice little touch. So I do appreciate that. And even a little bit of the grips on the soles of the feet along with that DC labeling there on the right foot, I think is also a welcome addition as well. So they managed to, for the most part, take advantage of the sculpting being a little higher, more proportion, and like I mentioned before, a bit more on the niche side than other manufacturers, especially when you get to that head sculpt, which is arguably the showstopper out of the entire ensemble, and for good reason. This is definitely an area that they needed to nail, because when it comes to figures of this caliber, you have companies like NECA that nailed it for the most part with 89 Keaton on their version. A lot of people hold that figure in high regard. Then you have Mezco doing a couple things here and there. I've seen the Mezco in person from the 89 version in like shelves and stuff whenever I go to like vendors and collectible trade shows like Frankenstein's, etc. I don't know what it is, but I think they went the extra mile on giving him those lips that he just looks like he's sucking on a lemon the entire time, and it just does not speak to me for some reason. You'd be happy to know that Beast Kingdom may have spoken to me with their Batman Returns. I've seen pictures and, like I said, in-person interactions with that Beast Kingdom 89, and once again, there's something kind of cartoony about that head sculpt. Not so much with this guy here. That is straight up Michael Keaton from 1992. And to see it in this format that is not Hot Toys, I gotta be honest, I am thoroughly impressed, especially for a price tag of $60. I will say that this is actually kind of leaning into a very accessible market for certain collectors that maybe don't want to go the full Hot Toys route, but maybe they want just something a little nicer looking on their shelf, better than even McFarlane Toys that is just a notch above, average consumer for the $20 price tag of the McFarlanes. But then you have companies like Mayfix and Figure Arts, and you're kind of waiting on them. They still have yet to put out a proper 89 or, well, they have a Keaton. Figure Arts has a Keaton, but it's not from the 89 or 1992 movies. It's from The Flash. And I've already mentioned my feelings towards that bastard. So it's good to see that we have a little bit of a palate cleanser, if you want to call it that, with the head sculpt on this guy. You see the lips, you see the skin tone, you even have the expression on the eyes, and then the actual sculpture work happening with the cowl itself. Very straightforward, very well made and well painted with the satin finish, and then you have the little wingtips here towards the bottom. That is straight up the Burton cowl along with Michael Keaton's likeness right underneath. And they, again, took advantage of that scaling. If you're going to be blowing it up here to being a little, for lack of a better term or lack of a better phrase, disproportionate to your other mainstay figures that are in the 6-inch or 7-inch market, take advantage of that scaling and make sure that you have some really great sculpt and detail happening with your likeness. And I feel like that is an ace head sculpt that is able to distract me from this cape. I gotta be honest, this is probably the biggest blemish that this thing brandishes is going to be this cape. The box advertises it as a full-on fabric cape, as a big selling point, and I guess you could say from one side you could argue that maybe that is in fact the case, because it's definitely emulating this kind of pleathery, texturized look. But once you actually feel it in hand, it's no more than just a nylon fabric that feels just a little bit cheap and easy to tear should you be fumbling and futzing around with it a little bit too much. Especially as time goes by, I can easily see this thing either flaking or chapping here towards the trimmings towards the bottom that are etched out in that bat design pretty modestly, but it's nothing to write home about. Then you do get a touch of premium quality when it comes to the wiring on the trimming on the far side of the in parts here. So you have a wire that then you can kind of stylize and bend to your will to make it look like it's either blowing in the wind, or you could stylize to make it look like he is kind of perched up on top like he does in those Burton movies to make it look very iconic and very cool. But to me, the fabric is made out of this material that's so difficult to work with that if they were going to do something like this, they should have wired, I don't want to say the entire cape, but more than just the outlines. You only got wires here on the front parts of the cape. It would have been nice to at least have gotten one more wire here in the middle, or two a little bit like a quarter of the way through right around this area right here. That way you're able to kind of use all four to grip it in a sort of way, because once you style these front wires in any sort of direction, whether it be like I said, like this, in a very dynamic, like I'm covered in the shroud of darkness sort of way, or if you were to then, like I said, stylize it in a way to kind of curve it towards the back so that then you could show off a little bit more of the arms like I had at the beginning of the review, you're then dealt with this kind of parachute kind of look to the rest of the cape that just makes him look much bigger than he needs to be, much more garish. And that's ironic considering that he came packaged in a very compartmentalized kind of way, like almost like this. He came packaged like this, so I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. You have wires to kind of fold it. Well, only really 2 wires. And because of the way that the fabric is made, everything just feels kind of loose towards the back, that it just feels like I'm origamiing his cape to then work in favor of the figure and not look so bulkish, not look like it's actually just kind of dangling around or looks like he's wearing a trash bag. This is probably, as you see right about right here, the best that I can do in such a short notice within the context of a review. And while we're on the subject of looseness, you'll notice that as I kind of move the figure around, that belt is just bouncing all over the place. Would have really appreciated some sort of adhesive to hold the belt in place, and I sort of understand as to why it is that they did this. This is very similar to, what was another figure that I did that recently where the belt was really... Oh, it was the Marvel Legends Doc Ock. It was in that review that I mentioned that I would have liked that harness to be placed somehow, but I understand why they did it because of the articulation, and it looks like it's a similar case here, except this doesn't have the coat. Nevertheless, the cape, a very much more affixed and much better posable cape to rely on to hold it in place from the back. So therefore, this thing is just bouncing all over the place, that even in the packaging, before I even opened him, the manufacturer, Beast Kingdom, they managed to package him like this. That thing was just loose and off to the side, and it was just bugging the hell out of my OCD. And again, I understand why it's there, and that's because there's a joint right underneath that does favor the articulation, which we're going to cover right now. Most of which we're going to cover right now, because they took a page out of Figure Arts and decided to go for that much more accurate head sculpt and cowl. A little bit too much, because though I appreciate the likeness and the build of the overall head and cowl, yeah, they leaned a little bit too much towards that accuracy that, you guessed it, just like in the movies, he cannot turn his head. It's pretty much one static piece, though unlike Figure Arts with that Flash Keaton, you actually do have just a little bit of nudging towards the sides. It's not any kind of rotation, but you can kind of hear a little bit of squeaking as there's a little bit of wiggle room to get him to rotate the head a few degrees to the left, a few degrees to the right, and then some slight tilting up and down that you could argue is mainly just there to let you bend those wires in different directions and not necessarily to favor any kind of articulation. But technically, you can kind of incline the head in different areas and different degrees, but not much else is happening there. It can even kind of do a little bit of a sassy shimmy, as I like to call it, from side to side. But again, don't blame you whatsoever for coming up for the argument that that's mainly just there to favor the cape. That's only there because the cape exists. Once you move past that, though, you do have these cutouts on the arm that allows it to fully rotate 360 degrees vertically, as well as properly extend via a hinge joint right there on the inside part of the top arm. And then you do have the biceps that are able to rotate fully 360. 2 joints at the elbows. However, I feel like the plastic kind of betrays the joints a little bit. It can only bend actually a pretty decent amount up to that point. I feel like it was a little limited before. Then we get to the wrists that technically have ball joints and allow the wrist to rotate a full 360. But when you get to bending them, holy shit, Beast Kingdom, this is not necessarily the best way to get in my good graces for my first figure out of your wave or out of your licensing agreement with WB here and the Batman series, because These wrist joints are pretty static even with a hairdryer pass, but to me, that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that even though rotation is allowed on both wrists, actually bending the wrists inwards and outwards, it can happen, but you need to really press them hard enough to the point where these hands come off for a very obvious reasoning, and we'll cover that momentarily, but they come off way too easily when trying to bend those wrist joints. Not even that, but upon doing so my first couple of times when I was messing with the figure just right out of the box, they flake an insurmountable amount of plastic residue on my fingers. You'll see some video here that I filmed with my phone when I was messing with the figure for the very first time, and I just have residue, plastic residue all over my fingertips, and I'm sorry if that comes across as a very bougie thing for me to say as a collector, but that is not a good sign. When you open any kind of figure, it doesn't matter if it's the basic consumer stuff from McFarlane, Marvel Legends, etc., the stuff that you could get easily at the store, or even professional high-tier stuff like Hot Toys. I pull a figure out and some of that plastic is weathering and tearing itself apart in my fingertips. That's a bad sign. It's a red flag in the same way that, and the reason why I'm using this as an example is because this recently happened to me and my girlfriend. It's the equivalent of going to a restaurant, ordering something kind of fancy with some drinks, and you get your food before you get your drinks. In that kind of vibe, that's how I feel whenever companies kind of put out a quality figure that you think is going to be quality, and then you bend pieces of the joints, and then you already have the Look, I even have some right now. Look at this. I'm sorry, but it's just a big no-no for me. It's a humongous peeve of mine, and I really do hope that on my second venture with Beast Kingdom, which there will be one, because I actually already bought the figure, there's going to be no red flags of this kind that will hopefully scare me away. But once you're able to get past those, technically the joints for the wrists are in fact there, and they can bend. It just demands a little bit of extraneous work to get them to bend inwards and outwards because of the way that mine was dealt. And you should definitely check yours should you be receiving your own Batman Returns Batman from Beast Kingdom, because that could potentially be a red flag. So going back to this loose belt, that's when we then get the two torso joints you got going on right here. You technically do have a mid-torso cut that kind of squeaks and edges to the sides. You can kind of hear it right there. It's a little bit rough, and it can barely turn, but it can definitely crunch inwards and outwards. It's actually very favorable as far as the crunching inwards and outwards, and a little bit of side to side. But to me, it's a major deficit to not have it allow it to rotate left and right, because the plastic was just molded in a very girthy kind of way that does not allow any sort of 360 movement. Same thing with the waist. Even though I mentioned just now that you do have a joint there that favors some decent amount of crunching inwards and outwards, it doesn't justify the looseness of the belt because of the way that it still does not rotate 360 degrees. So that is a humongous bummer. Then you get to the top leg joints where, again, I was thinking to myself, well, there's got to be a reason for why those gaps are there that don't flush to the rest of the body and shows off the roundness of the top leg joint. Well, in terms of mobility, it's definitely there, just at a caveat that it's very, very squeaky and feels very rough. And that's not meant to be a ratcheted joint. That's supposed to be a ball joint. But the fact that it's squeaking like that has me kind of scared of moving the joints at all. So you technically can bend them upwards and a little bit towards the back as far as the butt sculpt allows it. And you do not only also have extension towards the sides, that is very, very rough via that squeaking, but also a drop down joint. And you'll notice this when you revert the legs back to their original position. You'll see right there that it's actually rather abrasive the way that the drop down joint really is once you kind of scoot these back, and you'll notice the humongous gap between the crotch piece and the two legs. So the drop down joint is in fact there, and to get him back into position, you just got to give it a firm press up, but it's very robust to where I am definitely going to have to pull up that Q-tip and oil, just like I did with the recent Figure Arts 2099 Miguel O'Hara. Then you do have two joints at the knees covered by this rubberized plastic knee piece. So you got to be careful with this piece because when you revert the legs back to normal, they do get caught inside of the little pinched area of the joint. So do be careful. But you do have two knee joints right there that can bend almost all the way up, but for some reason they stop right about right there, and that's because of the way that the back part right here is cut. So unfortunately, it is a little stopped right there due to the way that it's molded. Wish that could have gone a little bit further, so a little lackluster there on the knee joints. Then you get to the ankles, where for the most part, you got some really decent flexibility of that ball joint that allows it to bend downwards like so, upwards like that, as far as this rubberized piece with the bat symbol allows it before it kind of conflicts with the piece, and some slight pivoting inwards and outwards, as well as rotation on the top part of the joint. So really good ankle joints overall. It's just that, once again, I don't know if this is a defect on mine personally or if it's a widespread issue. The right joint is just fine on this one. It's over on the left that for some reason, I don't know if it's broken legitimately, or maybe they just didn't sculpt the joint thick enough to hold the foot in place, because when I bend this thing downwards, and you'll notice just how loose this thing is really turning. Look at this. Look how loose that is. And there's a specific reason as to why this is so loose, and that's because when I try to bend the ankle down, foot comes off. It comes off almost as if the foot is meant to be interchangeable, except it's not. It really isn't. And so this is just really conflicting, and it's a little difficult to place back and to get the joint bending back into a neutral position, because you have to do simultaneous work of bending the joint and fitting the peg back into its slot to make sure that the foot doesn't come apart. Furthermore, you do have toesies that do bend a decent amount upwards, but not enough to, again, distract me away from the rather defective left ankle that, again, looks like was meant to be interchangeable, but I see no reason as to why it would be. So yeah, a little bit of a mixed bag thus far, and a little difficult to justify $60. It's not necessarily the most pricey figure, especially when you take into account that they're elevating the scale and the detail and sculpt work, but those joints really are being a little too faithful to the original Keaton costume that is barely able to move. And that's an understandable thing for the times, but once we now fast forward to 2024, you expect a figure to kind of suspend a little bit of that realism so that we can get them in some cool poses that we only really dream of. So is there anything to not only justify the $60 price tag, but maybe even adorn the figure to compensate for what we're lacking here as far as posability? Maybe some gadgets, some accessories. That's where I do think that we kind of rebound a little bit towards the positive side with Beast Kingdom, because they did in fact compensate. So though we don't get additional feet because of the way that this left one kept coming off, the hands did come off for a specific reason, even though I still would have appreciated those joints to be a bit more fluid and manageable. The fists that he comes with default are actually one of the interchangeable pair of hands he comes bundled in with. Per the box, Beast Kingdom decided to throw in 4 interchangeable pairs, except that's not exactly what we got. We actually ended up getting more. We got 10 hands total. And that's a little strange kind of running joke happening with Beast Kingdom and the back of their packaging, because there's some misdescriptions happening on the back of the box or the description of the figure, but in a positive light, in a way where I'm like, all right, yeah, you guys are giving us more than you even advertised. I don't know if it's like a licensing thing or a thing to kind of, I don't know. I don't know what the explanation really is. But apart from the fist, he comes with 2 regular neutral open hands, 2 what is being referred to as gadget gripping hands, which are meant to be these 2 that kind of look like they have a cutout in the middle to hold something cylindrical or stick-like. More on that later. 2 what I like to refer to as trigger happy hands, and obviously you'll see where these are going to be going towards too. And then 2, they're being referred to as dart gripping hands or dart holding hands. They're kind of semi-clenched, so they're not fully neutral or relaxed, but they're not completely clenched up like they are with the other ones that are meant to hold something kind of stick-like. These are kind of halfway through, and the reason for that is because Beast Kingdom threw in some gadgets, some wonderful toys to come with the Keaton Batman, some of which you've come to expect. Obviously, you're going to have the grapple and the batarang. The grapple, both of which are actually really well painted and sculpted, especially to scale with a 1/9 scale figure. And so this is arguably one of the finer versions of these forms of gadget from the Burtonverse, if you will, that aren't necessarily tied to either a Hot Toys or a NECA figure. And I personally have a stronger affinity for the grapple because of the way that it's modeled after a legitimate grappling gun. And so you have some decent work with the chrome right there, the circular chrome piece right there, and then the gold hook towards the front. Funny enough, both of these pieces can actually detach. I don't know what exactly is the function behind that, but it can do that. Just make sure not to lose it, but it does hold in place a pretty decent amount. And then you have the Batarang, which not only has very nice little chrome tips here towards the ends, but the inwards part has that iconic Michael Keaton look to the Batarang. And furthermore, they went ahead and attached this little string with the key ring or the little metallic ring here towards the end in case you ever want to display him like he's shooting it up towards something to, wrap it around, or if you want to dangle him from it with one of his hands. That's pretty cool and a nice little addition in case you ever want to do that. Adds a little bit of premium quality to that gadget. But the reason for why those hands were called dart gripping hands was because he comes with not one but 3 total darts. The back of the box again mentions that he only comes with 1 dart. Technically comes with 3. So it's cool to see that these are thrown in. I don't know why they're being referred to as darts. They look more like shuriken. So you technically do have these right here in case you ever want to have him hold them. And they are nicely painted and sketched out. They're actually a little bit on the pointy side, but nevertheless, they are just there to, just kind of be like adornments towards his hands to make him look like he's about to throw them. But they are susceptible to being lost. But they do have a nice little gold piece painted out there in the middle. And they come with 3 instead of just the 1. So in case you do lose one, you at least have 2 extra spares. Then we get our last gadget, which is the one that's not mentioned in the box at all. And it's the one that's meant to go into that stick holding hand. And it's going to be this piece. I can't remember the exact name of the gadget itself, but if I do remember correctly, this is supposed to be some kind of sequencer that allows him to break into things or get past locks, etc. I believe he uses it like once in Batman Returns. It's been a while since I've seen the movie, and I do believe he brought back a modernized version of it in The Flash during a specific scene. But you do have this chrome square there that is meant to emulate kind of like those little lights that brighten up whenever he's, kind of decrypting something, along with, of course, a nice little bat symbol right there in the middle. And aside from that, it's just a stick of black plastic that is meant to go into that, like I said, circular holding hand, like he's holding something like that resembles a stick or a circular device. Or if you happen to have any other gadgets that came with either the NECA or the McFarlane that's cylindrical, you could put one of those in that hand as well. So it's pretty cool that even though it's not in the description, they still managed to toss this in. It's not necessarily the most mind-blowing gadget, but it is in fact there, and a nice little welcome addition. So for roughly about $60, depending again where you get them from, depending on the vendor, shipping, etc., this is pretty much what Beast Kingdom is allotting for their release of the Batman Returns Michael Keaton Batman figure. And as my first foray into Beast Kingdom and what they offer, it's not necessarily the worst outing. I know that sounds a little backhanded. And I do appreciate how they were sensible enough to take advantage of the scaling. I know that it may rub some people the wrong way, that this is in fact 9 inches as opposed to 7. It's 1/9 scale. But to me, like I said, I'm all about being flexible with the creativity and being flexible and very smart with a niche market, being able to tackle something that nobody else has done before. Because if you talk to me and tell me that there was another company out there that's doing, once again, a 7-inch Batman, a 7-inch whatever that of a figure of a company that's already tackling that market, I'll be like, well, they're going to have to do something to kind of step it up or kind of make them stand out as rather unique. And I feel like Beast Kingdom is taking a step in the right direction with that scaling and taking advantage of that scaling with their really immaculate Michael Keaton head sculpt there, as well as the detail and paint accuracy to the suit itself and the welcome addition of accessories, especially with the multiple amount of hands and gadgets that are even a notch above what they even advertise on the box. However, there's still some major work to be done on the articulation. I understand that some of them may be leaning towards screen accuracy. I'm looking at the head sculpt in that regard. but not when it comes to those leg joints and those wrists and the quality control behind the flaking of the joints themselves that rubbed me in the most wrong way possible. And I know that that can make me come across as a little snooty or anything like that, but sometimes these criticisms, I want to put them out there because I definitely see an enormous amount of potential in Beast Kingdom to become a staple in collecting for many people, as long as they keep that price point manageable, because I personally believe that $60 is frankly not too bad for this. It really, really is not. It's not terribly expensive, but at the same time, it kind of, like I mentioned before, kind of threads that needle of going in a direction where it could be a little too expensive when you take the articulation into account, but then when it comes to value packaging, you see everything you see before you hear and think to yourself, that's not too bad. Once it starts to lean into like 80 or 90s where they're really gonna have to step it up and match that price point, because otherwise they're not going to become too much better off than Figure Arts. And Figure Arts has been coming under fire quite recently for very good reason. I'm looking at that Flash Keaton Batman because Jesus Christ, I legitimately regret buying that guy. And though they've already tackled Keaton before with that 89 version, I feel like this is almost like their 2.0, and having it be in the Batman Returns was a very good opportunity to take advantage of the mistakes they made with that 89 Keaton and kind of refine them, but they still have a way to go. And because of that, I'm going to be giving their Batman Returns Michael Keaton Batman a 7 out of 10. It's still a welcome addition into my collection and definitely didn't do anything too badly as far as kind of scaring me away from further pursuing other entries in my Batman collection from Beast Kingdom, especially since I already got one other one that I'll be tackling on a separate video review / comparison. But for now, I'll have to definitely temper my expectations with Beast Kingdom because there's still some chinks in the armor that need to be worked out. For the time being, let me know what you guys think of Beast Kingdom as a company. Do you own any figures from them? Are there any kind of pros and cons you have for those figures, whether they be Batman or Superman or any other characters that they've tackled thus far? Hell, even some of their Winnie the Pooh stuff, because I took a glance. I know that recently they also released some Aquaman stuff, but they even tackled some of the Disney stuff. They have a very diverse catalog of collectibles, and so I'm looking forward to seeing what else they can kind of put on the table, especially in regards to either Batman from DC or hell, even Spider-Man from Marvel. I'll definitely keep them on my radar, but for the time being at arm's length because of the things that they need to work on, specifically articulation. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the review, hit the thumbs up button. If not, hit the thumbs down. And as always, stay humble. I'll see you guys later.